And now we're going to go to our EQS London office, where Vivian joins, the managing director of the EQS London office. We'll interview our next speaker.
Please welcome our next guest, Dan McCrum. He is part of the investigations team at the Financial Times and the journalist behind the story The House of Wirecard, on which he has been reporting for 6 years. He exposed accounting problems at Wirecard, which finally brought the company down in 2020. He states that Wirecard was a con so grand that when it was finally exposed, the authorities struggled to believe it was possible. It hid in plain sight, with the help of professional services firms happy to lend it their reputations, and it was only through the actions of whistleblowers that a DAX 30 company was exposed as an empty shell. I'm looking forward to sharing some of the lessons from the scandal.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this session today. Dan, a very warm welcome to the ECEC 2020. We're really delighted to have you here to talk to us about the incredible Wirecard story. Now, obviously, I'm sure a few people, or many people in the audience today, have read about Wirecard. It's one of the biggest corporate scandals of the modern era. And just to set the picture from the beginning, in June of this year, Wirecard was due to announce its financial results. Instead, it announced that there was a 1.9 billion euro that had gone missing. Within a week, the CEO, Marcus Braun, had been arrested and the company had filed for insolvency. And since then, other members of senior management have been arrested, and the COO, Jan Marsalek, is still at large a fugitive.
Everybody, I think, certainly in financial markets, has a tendency to only do enough work that they need to do. And people assume that everyone else has done the required work. So EY were the long-standing auditor of Wirecard. Very professional banks raised money for it. And so I think everybody assumed that at some point there must be someone somewhere who is checking the company.
Wow, so this all came at quite a high personal cost to you, really, given that you ended up being investigated. How was that?
I mean, so there were times with the Wirecard investigation when it was deeply intimidating. You had this sense that you were fighting this huge, well-resourced financial institution. I mean, when we started publishing early last year, Wirecard was worth more than 20 billion euros, significantly more than Deutsche Bank. And you also had the sense that whatever you wrote, it didn't seem to matter. And then I was investigated personally by the German authorities. They opened a criminal investigation into my colleague and I. And all of that was very intimidating. And then Wirecard also, with these private detectives, constructed this sort of sting operation, which made it look like, again, we were in league with short sellers. But in terms of the accounting fraud, which became much, much larger, we discovered it really was an empty shell and its business was half the size it was claiming, and it had no profits whatsoever. You don't start out faking 1.9 billion euros. What you do is you start out very small. So probably around a decade ago, with these funny acquisitions, Wirecard was faking and hiding small amounts of profits. But every time you do that, I think a lot of times when you see this in frauds, people fudge the numbers, hoping to make it back the next quarter or the next year. But each year, the hole becomes bigger.
And then we come on to the broader question of culture. And did you get the impression when you're investigating the firm that this was, I mean, as you said, it's an accounting fraud as well as other sort of criminal activities. Did you get the impression that it was a few bad eggs at the top running this, or was there kind of a broader culture of essentially growth at all costs and real costs, or showing growth at all costs in any case to the market? Did you get a sense of that?
I mean, Wirecard employed, I think, about 5,000 or 6,000 people around the world. And most of them thought they were in a legitimate business. One of the funny things is, if you're doing an accounting fraud and you don't have to be profitable, you can create quite a large facade of a healthy business, because you can do things which other people can't do, and you don't have to worry about making money in the same way.
But in your view, it's always surprising when you come across these things as to how long this was allowed to go on for. And there were clearly lots of red flags, warning signs. You were investigating this externally, particularly at the beginning, with no sort of inside information. Why do you think Wirecard was so protected by the regulators, by investors? Good to get your thoughts.
So if you're trying to hide a fraud, there are a couple of things that you can learn from what Wirecard did. So one of the first things is you wrap yourself in complexity. So payment processing is fundamentally quite a simple business once you understand it. I put my credit card into a website, you contact my credit card issuer, you collect the money, and then you give it to the business. That's quite simple. But there's a lot of complexity around it. Because Wirecard owns a bank, it was sort of half technology company, half bank. And it used this to just make its figures very complicated. And so if you're trying to hide a fraud, what you do is you hire sort of control risks or another law firm, and you give them a narrow mandate, which means you control what information they're getting, and then you have them run their investigation. But obviously you've hobbled it from the start, and then you just take the conclusions and say, look, we have these very reputable people who looked into it and everything is fine. So the whistleblowers really were motivated by this desire to expose what was going on. They could tell that, criminal activity was happening.
Thanks. And I have another question here about compliance regularly being used as a shield. Do you think that this is the case, that it is regularly used as a shield? And how can we overcome that?
So in Wirecard's case, they did have a whistleblowing hotline, but what happened was that wasn't really a whistleblowing hotline. It was just a way for management to find out what people were worried about inside the company. So it was sort of immediately outing yourself. So you need to have all of the structures in place, but then if your chief executive or your finance director still wants to use it as a way to attack the whistleblower or even to find out who the whistleblower is, then you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, and I think actually it's an interesting example of showing that the reason for having, or one of the reasons for having channels in place, is that people come to you as an organization first, and if they're not dealt with correctly, then people do go externally. And this is, I think, a really good example of that happening in practice. We have another question that I actually meant to ask you earlier, which was to do with essentially what helped you to keep going, because there was tremendous pressure on yourself, on the FT. I mean, it shows extraordinary perseverance with an extremely high amount of pressure. So how did you do it, essentially?
So, I've been writing about Wirecard for 6 years, but there were periods in that it was extremely disheartening. So after Zatara, there was a long period where I sort of stopped looking into Wirecard just because I felt that with everything I'd written, I'd really taken the analysts and the investors to the water. But if they weren't going to drink it, then there was nothing more I could do. But and over time, though, because we were so sure of that there was something wrong with Wirecard, it did develop a bit of the character of obsession. I mean, it was known internally as Project Ahab, because the news editor Peter Spiegel called Wirecard my white whale after Moby Dick. So there was an element in which it became sort of like this personal battle that that I was determined to get to the bottom of it. And then what Wirecard did as well was it made it impossible for the FT to stop. So I think in January 2019, if Wirecard had gone, oh gosh, yes, no, this is really bad. We're going to fire everyone who'd been doing the bad stuff, and we're going to properly clean up. And yes, thank you, we should have done this. You're right. I think if they'd said that, we probably would have declared victory and gone, well, that was a great story. But because they said, no, this is totally false and the Financial Times is corrupt, it basically meant that we had to see it through to the end, if nothing else, for the reputation of the Financial Times. So there was a sense that we couldn't walk away from the story.
Okay, and actually, there's a linked question, which is, during the investigation, did you doubt yourself? Did you doubt the information that you were coming across, what you were reporting?
I never doubted the sense that we were dealing with this criminal enterprise, but there were things that you came across, because there was always this question: how much of the company is money laundering? How much of it is accounting fraud? And I think that let a lot of people, certainly investors, give Wirecard a pass. So people with money laundering, it's just gambling. People want to gamble, and some jurisdictions don't like it. So why should we worry? Clearly, that explains why it's so profitable. It doesn't want to talk about the details of its business too much. As we were reporting on it, you would come across things that you just couldn't believe. So a lot of the fraud centered on Dubai, where Wirecard's largest and by far most profitable subsidiary was based, something called Card Systems. And at one point, I remember being told that Card Systems wasn't audited. There was no local auditor in place. And that was just mind-boggling. The idea that you have this DAX 30 company who has this enormous business, and there is literally no auditor looking at it. It's just the guys from EY Germany show up occasionally. Like, it took a very long time for us to write it, because we had to be so sure of the sourcing, because we just couldn't believe it was true. And there were elements of that. And the head of the investigations team, I mentioned, Paul Murphy, he's a very experienced journalist. And he said there's, when you write stories like that, there's a sense that you've done everything you can, and you've gone to the end to find out what you can. But you still, as you press publish, you still feel like you're going to throw up, because you're like, what have we got wrong? What have we missed? So you constantly have these doubts about, can it really all be fake? Can it really be what we found? So yeah, it was doubts in that sense.
Okay, no, I think that makes sense. And another question that's come through is quite a general question, but do you have any general tips for whistleblowers in terms of, I suppose, how they can come to the press, or ideally how they can, report internally within organizations?
So again, it depends on the company. Some companies have existing whistleblower procedures in place. And I think one of the things that you ask if you're contacted by a whistleblower is, what happened? What avenues have you tried to go down already? And certainly that's a question that we will always ask when we're contacted by a whistleblower. And they may have very good reasons for not doing that, or I think more common is that they have tried to blow the whistle or raise things internally and have raised concerns, or in some circumstances just been fired. And so I think the tips would be: document everything, keep documents where you can. Obviously, there's certain difficulties associated with that. And, if it doesn't work out, please reach out to a journalist. This is what we are here for. So we are sort of that safety mechanism, if you were. And, one of the things that we treasure is sort of, it's like a gift from the sky when a whistleblower gets in touch and presents you with this story that you're like, we have to tell this. This is, I can't believe this is happening. So yes, that's whistleblowing is difficult and hard, and I have the greatest respect for anyone who chooses to do it.
Great, thank you. And just as a final question to wrap things up, what are the biggest lessons that have come from this generally, and also from a compliance perspective?
So the biggest lessons, I think, is you can have criminals hiding at the highest level of business and society who hide behind the reputations of others which are for sale. So you can hire auditors, hire law firms, you can hire compliance professionals to hide what you are up to. and you can hire PR firms to protect your reputation. And so the biggest lesson I think from this is to be aware that just because a company looks incredible, because someone is wearing a suit and a tie and doesn't look like a criminal, doesn't necessarily mean that they are innocent. And I think in terms of internally, the lessons that I would draw from this, if you were a professional, if you arrive in a company and find that there are no processes in place, that there are no procedures, that there is no paperwork kept, obviously you may have been hired to remedy that. But I think perhaps the question to be asked is, well, why has none of this happened? If it's a company in Wirecard's case, which has been operating for almost 2 decades at that point.
Super, thank you very much. I think that's very helpful, practical advice. And I think that brings us to the end of our time. So a huge thank you to you, Dan, for sharing the story of Wirecard. I think it's been fascinating. And I'm sure there were many more questions to come through. If you haven't, as the audience members, if you haven't looked into this, I would suggest that you do. It's absolutely incredible. And hopefully we can look forward to a book from Dan at some point on this.
There should be a book, The House of Wirecard, coming out hopefully late next year. I'm busy working on that. And thank you very much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure to tell the story. And if anyone is interested in reading more about it, the main magazine piece, which I wrote recently called Wirecard and Me, that is free to read. There is no subscription attached to that, although obviously do subscribe to the Financial Times. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks so much for being part of the ECEC.
Thank you so much, Vivian Joins, Managing Director of EQS in the UK, and Dan McCrum for the incredible story of Wirecard, a story of great courage and endurance. And yes, I'm sure there's a book coming out by Dan McCrum soon. And after that, I'm sure we'll get the feature film because the story is just incredible, larger than life.